Throughout World War II, there were a number of people who were recruited by the German authorities such as the SS and the Gestapo to hunt down resistance inside of occupied countries. Inside of lands such as Yugoslavia, there was a huge effort by local people to bring down the occupation and to fight against the German army. The Germans treated those who fought in the resistance terribly, and they were often tortured when captured. One example is a young teenage girl, Lepa Radic, a girl who helped the Partisans to evacuate wounded soldiers from the battlefield. However, Lepa Radic, at just the age of 17, was brought in front of a crowd and was executed, showing how ruthless the German army could be. But inside of Italy there was one man who created a group which became linked to the Germans and the Nazis, as they were responsible for hunting down partisans and taking a lead in anti-partisan activity inside the Republic of Salo. But Pietro Koch would be executed for his actions at just the age of 26. Join us today as we look at the execution of the man that Mussolini greatly feared, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Pietro Koch was born on the 18th of August 1918, and his father was an officer in the Imperial German Navy, and he was born in Benevento. He was a lieutenant in the Grenadiers after he enlisted in the Italian Royal Army in 1939, however he did not get on very well. Pietro was eventually sacked from the army, as he would insult and defy a superior officer, but then as the Second World War broke out, Mussolini would ally himself with his close friend Adolf Hitler. Because of this, Italy and the Nazis were allied together in the Axis alliance, and the Italians would be heavily involved in many campaigns of the Second World War, including even in Africa. But Pietro Koch was then called back into the army on the eve of the war, as Italy needed as many men as possible. But regardless of his previous discipline issues, Pietro saw service with the Italian army until the armistice with the Allies was signed in September 1943, but following this he then moved to Florence. Pietro then established himself in the Italian Social Republic in the north, which would later be led by Mussolini after Hitler placed him in control of the Nazi puppet state, following being freed by the Germans in the Gran Sasso raid. But then he joined the special service of the Republican police, which at the time were being led by Tullio Tamburini. But Pietro Koch would go further, as he would then establish a group of paramilitaries which would become notorious for their brutality and their actions. He established a Banda Koch, which was a special task force which would hunt down partisans inside of the Italian Social Republic. They would then hand over partisans to the Germans, where they were threatened with torture, incarceration inside a concentration camp, and even execution. The partisans in Italy had emerged as an anti-fascist movement and organisation, and they opposed the establishment of the Nazi puppet state in the north, and they also hated Mussolini. It would be partisans who would fight against Italian fascists, and they were the ones who executed Mussolini when he was later captured. Pietro Koch's group of men would be protected by the SD in Rome, and in particular by Herbert Kappler, the chief of the SD. He was colluding with the Nazis to defeat their enemies, and he was allowed free rein to do whatever he wanted with partisans, and because of this, Koch developed a reputation for being a brutal torturer. He did whatever he wanted, and Banda Koch were known for their cruelty, and their reputation spread within the partisans. He was even allowed to use his own prisons to hold them, and he also utilised torture chambers, trying to gain information and more info and intel from his captives. He wanted to bring down the partisans completely, and he used different torture methods to get this information. But he was also responsible for murder and execution, and it was believed that Pietro was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of partisans. He was a violent extremist, and there were others he was working with and collaborating with, including police chief Pietro Caruso, but he was a man who was greatly feared. The Italian Social Republic were concerned about his brutality, and they even granted an amnesty for political prisoners inside of the prisons who were not charged with murder. This was because the authorities worried that Pietro would wade into the prisons and would carry out more executions without any questions being asked. He was operating in a similar way as established brutes and organisations such as the SS and Heinrich Himmler would work, quietly carrying out executions. But as mentioned, Benito Mussolini even feared that Pietro Koch was a savage, and even the former fascist dictator of Italy was scared of him, and was greatly intimidated by his actions and also his group of soldiers. Mussolini was worried that at some point he would be taken prisoner in a power play by Pietro Koch to seize control, and Mussolini feared being held captive inside of one of his prisons. In fact, Mussolini even spoke with his close friend and ally, Renzo Montagna, about what to do with Pietro. They came up with a plan, and Montagna then arrested Pietro Koch for his involvement in brutal crimes, and with this, Pietro was rounded up, along with a number of his officers, and he was held in prison. In October 1944, Mussolini had him locked up, as he was ultimately worried, intimidated and scared by him, but he was then charged with brutality and crimes which were considered too much and were also considered very unnecessary. But then, as the war was turning greatly at this time against the Italians, the Allies, following the invasion of Sicily, were advancing north throughout the country quickly. They seized Rome and then Florence, and with this they rampaged into the Italian Social Republic, and Mussolini then went on the run before he was briefly captured. However, Pietro Koch then also fell into the hands of the Allies, and it's not known if the Allies realised the nature of his crimes. However, he was then handed over to an Italian tribunal to assess whether he was guilty or not. He was charged and convicted of 6 different offences relating to the murder and torture of partisans, and for this he was sentenced to death. On the 4th of July 1945, Pietro Koch was taken to Rome, and specifically to Fort Bravetta, and he was to be executed by a firing squad. He was joined by a number of guards and also a priest who administered him the last rites, next to the stool where he was to be executed upon. The firing squad was gathered, and they all stood in their black uniforms, armed with their rifles. Then Pietro was led over to the chair, where he was secured and tied to it. The stool was placed in a way that Pietro Koch would be shot in the back, which was considered very shameful in military circles, as it was honourable for someone to face their firing squad. But then the firing squad were ordered to get ready, and they readied their weapons before they shot straight into Pietro, killing him instantly. Officials then went to check the execution had been performed successfully, and it had. Pietro Koch was a man whose ruthlessness and brutality was unrivalled inside of Italy, to the point where Benito Mussolini even feared him. The former dictator of Italy then ordered his arrest, as he was concerned that Koch's forces would turn on him. But he was a man who had a history of notoriety, following being ousted out of the army, but he was a hunter who was responsible for the murder and executions of dozens of partisans. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.